The radar screen pulsed with 12 hostile contacts, their red diamonds closing fast on the lone civilian aircraft struggling through the storm clouds over the Baltic Sea. Inside the cramped cockpit of the aging Cessna 172, Marcus Volkov gripped the yoke with white knuckles, his daughter Alina sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, despite the turbulence that threatened to tear their small plane apart. The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and the radio crackled with increasingly urgent warnings from air traffic control about the restricted military airspace he'd inadvertently entered while trying to navigate around the massive weather system. What Marcus didn't know was that his desperate attempt to find clear sky had led him directly into the middle of a NATO joint training exercise, where tensions were already running high due to recent geopolitical developments. The exercise, codenamed Iron Thunder, involved fighter jets from 6 different nations conducting aggressive intercept scenarios. To the pilots converging on his position, his unscheduled appearance looked exactly like a probe by hostile forces, testing their response times and defensive capabilities. Squadron leader Katerina Ghost Rutkowski banked her F-16 Fighting Falcon hard to starboard, her helmet-mounted display painting the unknown aircraft in stark detail against the storm-darkened sky. The sleek gray fighter responded to her touch like a living thing, its General Electric F-110 engine producing 30,000 pounds of thrust as she accelerated toward the intercept. Through her radio, she could hear the controlled chaos of her fellow pilots calling out positions and weapon system status. The unknown aircraft's transponder was showing civilian codes, but intelligence briefings had warned them about exactly this kind of deception tactic. Anvil lead to unknown aircraft. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and follow my aircraft to the designated landing strip, Katerina transmitted, her voice carrying the authority earned through 15 years of military aviation and 3 combat deployments. She'd seen too many supposedly innocent flights turn into something far more dangerous to take anything for granted. In the Cessna, Marcus fumbled with the radio controls, his hands trembling as he tried to respond. Alina stirred beside him, her 8-year-old eyes opening to see the sleek fighter jet suddenly appearing outside their window like a metallic shark emerging from the clouds. The sight should have terrified her, but instead she pressed her face to the glass with wonder, watching the distant pilot in their cockpit. What none of them realized was that this chance encounter would resurrect ghosts from a conflict that had ended years ago, when a young flight instructor's innovative defensive maneuver had saved lives in a place where the world had almost forgotten to look for heroes. The sky held secrets that only experience could decode. The storm above them was nothing compared to the one brewing in 12 military minds, each calculating angles and intentions while racing through air thick with the possibility of violence. But sometimes the past speaks through present actions, and recognition can transform enemies into guardians in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Katerina adjusted her weapons systems and prepared for whatever came next, unaware that her target was about to perform a maneuver that would stop her cold and transport her back to a dusty airfield where everything she thought she knew about courage had been redefined by someone she'd never expected to see again. The GPS coordinates on her heads-up display meant nothing compared to the coordinates of memory that were about to be activated. The fuel in the Cessna continued to drop, and time was running out for all of them. But in military aviation, time is often measured not in minutes but in the split seconds between recognition and action, between suspicion and understanding, between the impulse to fire and the wisdom to hold. Katerina's finger rested lightly on the weapon select switch, her training warring with an instinct she couldn't yet name. Below them, the dark waters of the Baltic Sea reflected nothing but storm clouds and the shadows of aircraft whose intentions remained as murky as the weather that had brought them all together. The radio frequency buzzed with tense communications from ground control, vectoring additional fighters to the intercept, while simultaneously trying to establish communication with the civilian aircraft that had stumbled into their carefully choreographed exercise. Marcus knew none of this tactical complexity. He knew only that his daughter needed medical attention in Stockholm, that their original flight plan had been destroyed by weather systems that seemed to appear from nowhere, and that the fuel tanks were approaching a level that would force them down into the unforgiving sea below. The fighter jet outside his window was both his greatest fear and potentially his only salvation, though he had no way of knowing which role it would ultimately play. In the distance, more fighters were approaching, their contrails visible against the storm clouds like arrows pointed at his heart. The radio frequency erupted with military call signs and intercept procedures that sounded like a foreign language to civilian ears. Alina watched it all with the fascination that only children possess when witnessing events they don't yet understand the gravity of. Her small hand pressed against the window as if she could touch the incredible machines surrounding them. The moment of truth was approaching with the inevitability of physics and the uncertainty of human judgment, where decisions made in seconds would ripple through lives in ways that none of them could foresee. The sky was about to witness either a tragedy or a miracle, depending entirely on whether the past could speak loudly enough to be heard above the roar of jet engines and the static of military communications. Katerina's training told her to maintain intercept protocol and prepare for escalation if the unknown aircraft failed to comply with instructions. Her experience told her that civilian pilots often panicked in these situations and made poor decisions that escalated minor violations into major incidents. But something deeper, some instinct honed by years of reading the sky and the machines that moved through it, suggested that this situation was different from the training scenarios and real-world intercepts she'd participated in throughout her career. The unknown aircraft's flight path showed signs of distress rather than hostile intent, but distress could be feigned, and hostile intent could be disguised as mechanical problems. The intelligence briefings had been very specific about the sophisticated nature of modern aerial reconnaissance, where even engine failures could be staged to create opportunities for intelligence gathering or to test response protocols. Katerina had to assume hostile intent until proven otherwise, but she also had to be prepared to recognize genuine emergency situations that required assistance rather than aggressive intercept procedures. The radio crackled again with updated instructions from ground control, informing her that additional fighter assets were being scrambled to provide backup for the intercept mission. The unknown aircraft continued on its erratic course, neither acknowledging radio transmissions nor showing any indication that it was aware of the military aircraft converging on its position. This could indicate either communication equipment failure or deliberate disregard for air traffic control instructions, both of which required different tactical responses. Marcus finally managed to establish radio contact, his voice tight with stress as he transmitted his emergency situation to any aircraft that might be listening. The words tumbled out in a mixture of English and his native language, describing his daughter's medical condition and his urgent need to reach Stockholm before his fuel ran out completely. The transmission was broken and difficult to understand due to atmospheric interference from the storm, but the desperation in his voice was unmistakable to anyone who had ever faced a genuine emergency. Katerina's blood ran cold as she heard something in that transmission that transcended language barriers and military protocols. It was the sound of a father's fear, raw and unfiltered, cutting through the professional detachment that military training instilled in combat pilots. She'd heard that same tone in her own voice years ago, in a place where the rules of engagement meant nothing compared to the imperative to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The memory hit her like turbulence, sudden and disorienting, threatening to shake loose the careful compartmentalization that allowed her to function in high-stress situations. She'd been trying to forget that deployment for years, pushing down the images and emotions associated with missions that had required her to make impossible choices between duty and humanity. But the desperate voice on the radio frequency was unlocking doors in her memory that she'd thought were permanently sealed. The other fighters in the formation continued their approach, their pilots unaware of the internal struggle taking place in their squadron leader's mind. Ground control continued to issue instructions based on standard intercept procedures, treating the situation as a potential security threat that required immediate resolution. The civilian aircraft continued its erratic flight path, running out of fuel and options while surrounded by military assets that could either save or destroy it depending on decisions that would be made in the next few minutes. Alina pressed her face closer to the window, watching the fighter jet with an expression of pure wonder that reminded Katerina of her own daughter at that age, before the divorce and the custody battles, and the choice between family and career that had ultimately cost her both. The sight of a child's face in the civilian aircraft's window struck her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the human cost of military decisions that were usually made at distances that allowed for emotional detachment. The storm around them seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the tension building between the aircraft. Lightning flickered through the clouds, illuminating the scene in stark black and white moments that made everything appear frozen in time. The radio frequency buzzed with increasingly urgent communications from ground control, demanding immediate compliance from the civilian aircraft while simultaneously vectoring additional military assets to the intercept point. Marcus began to perform a series of flight maneuvers that he hoped would communicate his peaceful intentions to the military pilots surrounding him. He'd learned these procedures years ago during his pilot training, though he'd never expected to use them in a real-world situation. The maneuvers were subtle but distinctive, designed to signal compliance and cooperation to military aircraft while maintaining control of his own aircraft in challenging conditions. What Marcus couldn't know was that his improvised signals were about to trigger recognition in a mind that had filed away similar memories from a very different time and place, where the roles had been reversed and the stakes had been measured in lives rather than diplomatic incidents. The sky was about to become a stage for the resurrection of old ghosts and the settlement of debts that neither party had realized were still outstanding. The fuel gauge in the Cessna continued its relentless descent toward empty, marking time with mechanical precision, while human hearts beat with increasing urgency. The fighters maintained their formation, their pilots waiting for orders that would determine whether this encounter ended in tragedy or salvation. The storm showed no signs of abating, forcing all of them to navigate not only through treacherous weather, but through the even more dangerous territory of split-second decisions with permanent consequences. Katerina's finger hovered over her radio transmit button as she struggled to reconcile her military training with instincts that were telling her this situation was not what it appeared to be. The unknown aircraft's flight characteristics suggested genuine distress rather than hostile reconnaissance, but appearances could be deceiving, and the consequences of making the wrong decision could be catastrophic. She needed more information, but time was running out for everyone involved. The first maneuver Marcus performed was a gentle banking turn to the left, followed by a series of wing rocks that were barely perceptible through the turbulence but clearly intentional to trained military eyes. It was an old signal, one that predated modern communication systems, and relied on the universal language of flight itself to convey meaning across cultural and linguistic barriers. The maneuver was performed with a precision that suggested advanced pilot training, though the aircraft itself appeared to be a standard civilian model with no military modifications. As soon as Katerina saw the wing rocks, her mind began racing through memories of similar signals she'd encountered during her various deployments. The maneuver was textbook perfect, executed with the kind of muscle memory that only came from extensive practice under high-stress conditions. It suggested that the pilot of the civilian aircraft had military training, though that could mean anything from former Air Force experience to current enemy personnel operating under cover of civilian credentials. The second maneuver was more complex, involving a series of altitude changes that formed a specific pattern recognizable to military pilots as a distress signal that predated radio communications. Marcus was essentially flying Morse code, using his aircraft's position in three-dimensional space to spell out letters that any competent military pilot would be able to read. The message was simple but clear: medical emergency, request assistance. But it was the third maneuver that stopped Katerina's heart and sent her mind reeling back through years of carefully suppressed memories to a dusty airfield, where a young flight instructor had saved her life using exactly the same combination of aircraft movements. The maneuver was so distinctive, so specific to one particular tactical situation, that there was only one place she could have learned it and only one person who could have taught it to someone else. The maneuver began with a sharp climbing turn to the right, followed by a shallow dive that brought the aircraft back to its original altitude, but displaced laterally by exactly 2 aircraft lengths. It was then repeated in mirror image, creating a figure-8 pattern in the vertical plane that served no obvious tactical purpose unless you understood its historical context. It was a maneuver that had been developed in response to a very specific threat scenario, one that most military pilots would never encounter in their entire careers. Katerina's hands began to shake as she watched the civilian aircraft complete the maneuver with textbook precision, every angle and timing exactly, as she remembered learning it years ago from someone who had insisted that unconventional problems required unconventional solutions. The maneuver had no official designation in any military manual, because it had been developed in the field by someone who valued effectiveness over proper procedure, someone who had understood that saving lives sometimes required breaking rules. The radio frequency erupted with confused chatter from the other pilots in the formation, none of whom recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. To them, it appeared that the civilian aircraft was performing aerobatic maneuvers that seemed completely inappropriate for an emergency situation. Ground control began issuing increasingly urgent instructions for the civilian aircraft to cease maneuvering and follow intercept protocols. But Katerina barely heard them through the roar of memory that was overwhelming her carefully maintained professional composure. She keyed her radio with trembling fingers, her voice barely steady as she transmitted a single word that she hadn't spoken aloud in more than 5 years. Dust Devil. It was a call sign that belonged to another time and place, to someone who had taught her that courage wasn't about following orders, but about knowing when to break them for the right reasons. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge across time, carrying with it the weight of shared experiences that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. In the Cessna, Marcus nearly lost control of the aircraft when he heard that call sign crackling through his radio speakers. It was a name he'd tried to forget, associated with memories that had driven him out of military service and into the quiet anonymity of civilian life. He'd never expected to hear it again, especially not under circumstances that placed his daughter's life in the hands of someone he'd once known better than anyone else in the world. Alina looked up at her father with concern as she saw tears streaming down his face, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture of comfort that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. She didn't understand the significance of what was happening around them, but she could see that something important was occurring, something that was affecting her father in ways that transcended their current emergency situation. The fighter jet outside their window suddenly seemed less threatening, and more like a guardian angel that had appeared at exactly the moment they needed it most. The other pilots in the formation continued to maintain their intercept positions, waiting for instructions from their squadron leader, while trying to understand the sudden change in the tactical situation. Ground control continued to transmit orders based on standard protocols, but there was confusion in the voices of the controllers as they tried to interpret the unusual communications they were hearing from both the civilian aircraft and their own military assets. The situation was rapidly moving beyond the scope of normal intercept procedures into territory that required human judgment rather than automated responses. Katerina took a deep breath and made a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone involved, keying her radio again to transmit instructions that deviated from every protocol she'd been trained to follow. Her voice was steady now, carrying the authority of someone who had learned to trust her instincts even when they conflicted with official procedures. The words she spoke next would either save lives or end her military career, but she'd learned long ago that some choices were too important to be guided by fear of consequences. The storm around them continued to rage, but inside the various cockpits scattered across the sky, a different kind of weather system was beginning to clear. Recognition was dawning like sunlight breaking through clouds, illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadow for too long. The past was about to collide with the present in ways that would transform everyone involved, but especially the child who sat watching it all unfold with eyes that still believed in the possibility of happy endings. Time seemed to slow as multiple aircraft adjusted their positions in response to new instructions that prioritized human life over military protocol. The fuel gauge in the Cessna continued to drop, but hope was beginning to rise in its place, carried on radio waves that bridged the gap between former comrades who had found each other again in the most unlikely of circumstances. The sky was about to witness the kind of redemption that only occurred when the past offered its gifts to the present at exactly the moment they were needed most. "Dust Devil, this is Ghost Leader," Katerina transmitted, her voice carrying years of regret and relief in equal measure. "I have you covered. Follow my lead to emergency landing coordinates." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of promises made and kept, of debts both owed and forgiven, of second chances that arrived exactly when they were needed most. The formation of fighters began to shift from an intercept pattern to an escort formation. Their mission transformed from potential engagement to protective assistance in the space between two heartbeats. Marcus keyed his microphone with hands that were steady for the first time since the crisis began, his voice carrying gratitude that transcended words as he acknowledged the instructions from someone he'd never expected to see again. Alina clapped her hands together with delight as she watched the fighters take up protective positions around their small aircraft, turning what had seemed like a threatening situation into something that felt like the most elaborate escort mission ever arranged for a little girl and her father. The radio frequency buzzed with new communications as ground control updated flight plans and emergency services prepared for an incoming medical evacuation. The storm was beginning to break up, revealing patches of clear sky that promised safe passage to the emergency landing field that had been designated for their use. The fuel situation remained critical, but it was no longer a death sentence thanks to the expert navigation assistance being provided by pilots who understood exactly how to squeeze every last mile out of limited resources. As the formation of aircraft began its descent toward the emergency airfield, Katerina found herself remembering why she'd become a pilot in the first place. It hadn't been for the military prestige or the advanced technology or even the thrill of flight itself. It had been for moments exactly like this one, when skill and training and human compassion combined to transform impossible situations into miraculous outcomes. She'd lost sight of that purpose somewhere along the way, buried under layers of bureaucracy and politics and the grinding routine of peacetime military service. But now, shepherding a civilian aircraft to safety through weather that would have challenged even experienced military pilots, she felt the old fire returning. This was what aviation was supposed to be about, using machines to extend human capability in service of human need. The fighter jet under her control wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a tool for peace, a means of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, a bridge between the military world and the civilian world that it existed to serve. The emergency landing field appeared through the clouds like an island of salvation, its runway lights cutting through the gloom to provide a clear path to safety. Emergency vehicles were already positioning themselves along the runway, their red and blue lights creating a welcoming beacon for the incoming aircraft. Medical personnel stood ready to assist Alina as soon as the Cessna touched down. Their presence, a reminder that this mission was ultimately about saving a child's life rather than intercepting potential threats. Marcus lined up for his approach with the precision of someone who had learned to fly in conditions far more challenging than civilian training typically provided. The Cessna responded to his touch like an extension of his own will, its controls familiar despite the years that had passed since he'd flown anything more complex than weekend recreational flights. The muscle memory of military aviation training never really faded. It just waited patiently for circumstances that required its resurrection. Alina pressed her face to the window one last time, waving at the fighter jets that had become her guardian angels during the most terrifying and wonderful flight of her young life. The pilots couldn't see her small hand against the window, but something in the way their aircraft maintained perfect formation spoke of professional dedication that had transformed into personal commitment. They would stay with the Cessna until it was safely on the ground, because that's what real pilots did for each other regardless of the uniform they wore or the aircraft they flew. The landing was textbook perfect, with the Cessna touching down exactly on the center line of the runway despite crosswinds that would have challenged much larger aircraft. Marcus rolled to a stop near the waiting emergency vehicles, his hands still steady on the controls even as relief flooded through him in waves that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. They were safe. Alina would receive the medical attention she needed, and somehow the past had reached forward to save the future in ways that seemed too miraculous to be real. Katerina overflew the field once to confirm that the civilian aircraft had landed safely before beginning her own approach to the military section of the airfield. Her squadron would debrief the incident according to standard procedures, but she knew that the real story of what had happened today would never appear in any official report. Some encounters transcended the bureaucratic requirements of military documentation, existing instead in the realm of human experience, where recognition and redemption operated according to rules that no manual could capture. As she taxied to her designated parking spot, Katerina could see medical personnel helping Alina out of the Cessna, while her father spoke urgently with doctors about her condition. The little girl seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just experienced what amounted to an international incident, looking around the military airfield with the same wonder she'd shown when watching the fighter jets through her window. Children possessed a resilience that adults often forgot, an ability to find joy and excitement even in situations that terrified the grown-ups around them. The debriefing would wait until later, after the immediate crisis had been fully resolved and Alina had received proper medical attention. For now, it was enough to know that the mission had been successful, that civilian lives had been protected, and that the complex machinery of international military cooperation had functioned exactly as it was supposed to when human judgment guided technological capability. The storm was clearing, both meteorologically and metaphorically, revealing a sky that promised better weather ahead for everyone involved. Marcus found himself surrounded by military personnel who treated him with the respect accorded to a fellow aviator rather than a civilian who had violated restricted airspace. They understood, in the way that only pilots could understand, that he had done everything possible under impossible circumstances to protect his daughter, while navigating through conditions that would have challenged even experienced military crews. There would be paperwork to complete and official explanations to provide, but none of that mattered compared to the fact that Alina was safe and receiving the care she needed. The fighter jets that had escorted them to safety were already being prepared for their return flight to the exercise area, their crews moving with the efficient professionalism that characterized military aviation operations. But something had changed during the mission, some shift in perspective that would linger long after the aircraft were serviced and the reports were filed. They had been reminded that their training and equipment existed ultimately in service of human life, and that reminder would influence how they approached their duties in ways both subtle and profound. Elena waved goodbye to the military personnel as she was loaded into the medical transport vehicle that would take her to the hospital in Stockholm. Her adventure was ending, but the memories she had accumulated would last a lifetime. The sight of fighter jets materializing from storm clouds like mechanical angels, the feeling of being protected by skilled pilots who turned potential threats into guardian escorts, and the knowledge that her father's mysterious past had somehow provided exactly the salvation they needed when conventional help seemed impossible. As the medical transport disappeared into the distance, carrying Elena toward the specialized treatment that would restore her health, the various military personnel began the process of returning to their normal duties. But normal had been redefined by the day's events, expanded to include possibilities that training manuals couldn't capture and protocols couldn't anticipate. They had witnessed the transformation of potential conflict into miraculous rescue, and that transformation had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The radio frequencies gradually returned to routine traffic as the exercise resumed its planned scenarios, but the memory of desperate voices and unexpected recognition continued to echo in the minds of everyone who had participated in the real-world drama that had unfolded above the Baltic Sea. Some missions became legends not because of their complexity or danger, but because of their humanity, and this mission was destined to be remembered long after the technical details had been forgotten. Katerina completed her post-flight checks with the methodical precision that years of military training had made automatic, but her mind was elsewhere, processing emotions and memories that she had thought were permanently buried. The encounter with Marcus had reopened channels of communication with parts of herself that she had cut off when the military became more about politics than about flying, more about bureaucracy than about the pure joy of aviation that had originally drawn her to the cockpit. The maintenance crews who serviced her fighter jet noticed that she took longer than usual with her post-flight inspection, running her hands along the aircraft's surfaces with something approaching affection rather than routine professional assessment. The machine had performed flawlessly during the mission, responding to her commands with the precision that modern military aviation demanded. But it had also served as an instrument of mercy rather than war, and that service had transformed both pilot and aircraft in subtle but important ways. As evening fell over the airfield, the last of the paperwork was completed, and the official reports were filed with appropriate military channels. The incident would be classified as a successful resolution of a civilian emergency, with appropriate commendations noted for the pilots who had demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure. But the real story of what had happened would live on in the memories of those who had experienced it, a reminder that the sky could still surprise even the most experienced aviators with moments of recognition and redemption. Marcus spent the night in the hospital with Elena, watching over her as medical specialists worked to stabilize her condition and prepare her for the surgical procedure that would correct the congenital heart defect that had precipitated their emergency flight. The crisis that had driven them into restricted airspace was finally being addressed by people with the proper training and equipment. But Marcus knew that Elena's survival depended as much on the miraculous intervention of military pilots as it did on medical expertise. Elena slept peacefully despite the strange surroundings and medical equipment, her dreams filled with images of silver aircraft dancing through storm clouds like metallic birds performing aerial ballet for her personal entertainment. She didn't understand the complex chain of events that had brought them to safety, but she understood that something wonderful had happened, something that proved heroes really did exist and sometimes appeared exactly when they were needed most. The fighter squadron returned to their home base the following morning, their aircraft gleaming in sunlight that seemed brighter than usual after the storm had passed. The routine of military life resumed its normal patterns, but something fundamental had shifted in the way the pilots approached their duties. They had been reminded that their skills existed ultimately in service of human life, and that reminder would influence their decisions in ways both subtle and profound for years to come. Katerina found herself thinking about civilian aviation in ways she hadn't considered since her early training days, when the distinction between military and civilian flying had seemed arbitrary and artificial. The skills were transferable, the physics were identical, and the fundamental purpose, using machines to extend human capability, was the same regardless of the uniform worn or the mission assigned. The encounter with Marcus had reminded her that aviation was ultimately about connections, between people, between places, and between the dreams that lifted humans into the sky and the reality that brought them safely back to Earth. The official debriefing focused on tactical procedures and communication protocols, analyzing the incident for lessons that could be applied to future training scenarios. But the unofficial conversations that took place in ready rooms and flight lines were about different kinds of lessons. The importance of human judgment in automated systems, the value of experience in interpreting ambiguous situations, and the reminder that military personnel were ultimately civilians in uniform, serving communities and families that included their own loved ones. Marcus received a commendation from the Swedish military for his airmanship during the emergency, recognizing his skill in navigating through challenging conditions while maintaining communication with military aircraft under stress. The citation noted his professional handling of a complex situation and his cooperation with international military forces, but it couldn't capture the emotional weight of recognition that had transformed a potentially tragic situation into a miraculous rescue. Alina's surgery was completely successful, correcting the heart defect that had threatened her life and promising a future filled with the normal activities of childhood that her condition had previously made dangerous. The medical team credited the rapid response time made possible by the military escort for her positive outcome, noting that delays caused by weather or airspace restrictions could have made the surgical intervention much more complicated and risky. Recovery was swift for someone so young, and within a week Alina was asking when she could see the fighter jets again, her memories of the rescue flight having transformed from terror to adventure in the way that only children could manage. She drew pictures of aircraft for the nurses and doctors, her artistic interpretations featuring silver jets with friendly faces and helpful attitudes that reflected her experience rather than the threatening stereotype usually associated with military aircraft. The story of the rescue began to circulate through military aviation communities, spreading from squadron to squadron and base to base, as an example of how training and human judgment could combine to transform potential disasters into successful missions. Details were embellished and simplified in the retelling, but the core message remained consistent. Aviation professionals looked out for each other regardless of the uniform they wore or the aircraft they flew. Marcus returned to civilian flying with a new appreciation for the international military forces that maintained security in the skies he navigated for recreation and business. His violation of restricted airspace had been officially classified as an emergency incursion, with no penalties assessed, recognizing that his actions had been driven by medical necessity rather than deliberate disregard for aviation regulations. The incident had reminded him that the skills he had learned during his military service remained valuable even in civilian contexts. Katerina found herself volunteering for additional training exercises that involved civilian-military cooperation, using her experience from the Baltic Sea incident to help develop protocols for similar emergency situations. Her insights into the challenges faced by civilian pilots in distress proved valuable for training military personnel to distinguish between genuine emergencies and potential security threats, improving response times and reducing the risk of misunderstandings. The weather patterns that had created the storm began to shift as seasonal changes brought clearer skies to the Baltic region, but the lessons learned during those turbulent hours continued to influence the pilots who had participated in the rescue. They approached their duties with renewed understanding of the human element that ultimately gave meaning to all their technical training and sophisticated equipment. Alina returned to school with stories that her classmates initially found difficult to believe, but the newspaper articles and official citations provided documentation that her adventure had really happened. She became something of a celebrity among her peers, known as the girl who had been rescued by fighter jets, though she remained remarkably grounded despite the attention. Her teachers noted that the experience seemed to have matured her in positive ways, giving her confidence and perspective that served her well in academic and social situations. The exercise that had been interrupted by the emergency was eventually completed, with the participating military units incorporating lessons learned from the real-world rescue into their training scenarios. The incident became a case study in joint operations, demonstrating how international military cooperation could function effectively when human lives were at stake, regardless of the political tensions that might exist between participating nations. Marcus began writing about his experience, crafting articles for aviation magazines that emphasized the importance of maintaining flight skills even during periods of civilian flying, and the value of understanding military procedures for pilots who might inadvertently encounter military aircraft during emergencies. His writing combined technical expertise with personal narrative, creating educational content that was both informative and emotionally engaging for readers who might face similar situations. The Baltic Sea returned to its normal patterns of civilian and military traffic, but the airspace that had witnessed the rescue retained a special significance for those who had participated in the events. Future military exercises in the region were conducted with enhanced awareness of civilian aircraft that might require emergency assistance, and new protocols were developed to streamline the process of providing aid to distressed civilian pilots. Katerina discovered that the incident had rekindled her passion for flying in ways that surprised her, reminding her of the pure joy that had originally drawn her to aviation before military bureaucracy had complicated her relationship with the profession. She began seeking assignments that emphasized the service aspect of military aviation, using her skills to participate in humanitarian missions and emergency response operations that connected her daily duties to tangible human benefit. The fighter jets that had participated in the rescue returned to their routine training missions, but their crews carried with them the memory of an afternoon when their advanced military aircraft had served as instruments of mercy rather than war. The experience influenced their approach to training scenarios, adding layers of meaning to exercises that might otherwise have seemed abstract or disconnected from real-world applications. Alina's heart condition was completely resolved by the surgical intervention, allowing her to participate in physical activities that had previously been restricted by her medical limitations. She took up athletics with enthusiasm, excelling in sports that required the kind of courage and determination she had displayed during the emergency flight. Her coaches noted her unusual composure under pressure, attributing it to experiences that had taught her the value of remaining calm during challenging situations. The international cooperation demonstrated during the rescue became a model for similar operations, with military aviation authorities developing new protocols for handling civilian emergencies in restricted airspace. The incident proved that existing systems could be adapted quickly and effectively when human judgment guided technological capability, leading to policy changes that prioritized humanitarian concerns over bureaucratic procedures in emergency situations. Marcus and Alina's relationship was strengthened by their shared experience, creating a bond that went beyond the normal father-daughter connection to include mutual respect for each other's courage during crisis. Alina had seen her father handle an impossible situation with skill and determination, while Marcus had witnessed his daughter's remarkable resilience and adaptability under stress. These observations would influence their relationship for years to come, creating a foundation of trust and understanding that would serve them well during future challenges. The storm that had created the emergency conditions finally dissipated completely, leaving behind clear skies that seemed to promise better weather ahead for everyone involved. The Baltic Sea reflected sunlight instead of lightning, and the aircraft that traversed its airspace did so under conditions that emphasized the beauty of flight rather than its dangers. But the memory of turbulent weather and the recognition that had emerged from it continued to influence the pilots who had participated in the rescue. Katerina began mentoring younger pilots, sharing her experience from the Baltic Sea incident as an example of how training and instinct could combine to create positive outcomes even in situations that seemed hopeless. Her students learned not just the technical aspects of military aviation, but the importance of maintaining humanity even in high-stress situations where protocol might suggest more aggressive responses. The maintenance crews who had serviced the aircraft involved in the rescue took special pride in their work, knowing that their technical expertise had contributed to saving a child's life. They approached their duties with renewed understanding of how mechanical precision translated into human safety, paying extra attention to details that might seem minor but could prove critical during emergency operations. Alina kept in touch with some of the military personnel who had participated in her rescue, writing thank you letters that were treasured by pilots and ground crews, who rarely received direct feedback about the human impact of their professional duties. Her letters reminded them that their training and service had tangible meaning beyond the abstract concepts of national security and international cooperation. The media coverage of the incident focused on the positive aspects of international military cooperation and the successful resolution of a civilian emergency, providing a counterpoint to news stories that typically emphasized conflict and tension between nations. The rescue became a symbol of how military forces could serve humanitarian purposes, demonstrating that sophisticated military equipment and training could be redirected toward life-saving missions when circumstances required such flexibility. Aviation safety organizations incorporated lessons learned from the incident into their training materials, using the Baltic Sea rescue as an example of how proper emergency procedures and effective communication could prevent tragic outcomes even in complex international airspace situations. The case study became required reading for pilots seeking ratings that would allow